The rusty treasure. The air in the barn, thick with the scent of damp straw and aged timber, was the unmistakable overture to a country auction. Thomas meandered past rows of discarded implements and forgotten furnishings, his boots stirring fine dust that shimmered in the sunbeams, slicing through the old walls. Near a cluster of worn milking stools, a knot of farmers bantered, their laughter resonating as they haggled over a chipped enamel pot. Thomas, however, felt a magnetic pull toward the barn's deeper recesses, where the light dissolved into a murky twilight. There, half shrouded by a tattered canvas and a jumble of fence posts, lay a colossal silent shape, caked in a thick hide of rust. It was, without a doubt, a tractor, not one of the newfangled behemoths with their climate-controlled cabins and digital dashboards, but an antique relic. As he drew nearer, batting away a cobwebbed tarpaulin, the form resolved itself, a derelict 1957 Farmall. Its once vibrant red paint had faded to a mottled, flaking skin, a hue more akin to dried blood. One headlight was a shattered void, the other entirely absent, leaving twin vacant sockets. The tires were deflated, their rubber cracked and brittle, while a tenacious vine had throttled the steering wheel in a botanical embrace. A few curious onlookers drifted by, their gazes skimming the decrepit machine before moving on with a shake of the head or a dismissive chuckle. "Waste of space," grumbled one man, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Cost more to haul it off than it's worth." Another, younger, with a neatly trimmed beard, snickered. "Looks like it's been collecting squirrels since the Eisenhower administration." Thomas paid them no mind. His fingers, roughened by years of odd jobs and farmhand duties, traced the engine block's corroded metal. He squatted, peering beneath, noting the intact axles and a surprisingly robust frame. Rust, yes, but no deep rot, not yet. He ran his palm over the faded Farmall decal, a ghost of its former glory. To him, this wasn't mere scrap. It was a gauntlet thrown, a silent vow. He saw beyond the decay, past the broken parts and the mocking laughter. He envisioned potential, a dormant power waiting to roar to life. He saw fields of corn swaying under a summer sky, rows of tomatoes ripening, a future he could cultivate with his own hands. He imagined the engine's growl, the rhythmic thrum of pistons, the satisfying bite of a plow turning rich soil. This vision had sustained him through lean times, thankless tasks, and endless days. This Farmall, though a skeletal shadow, was the first tangible piece of that dream. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a portly man with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, finally ambled over, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Interested in that old beast, are we, Tommy?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. "Been sitting there for 20 years, maybe more. Grandpa's old tractor. Figured no one would ever even look at it." "How much?" Thomas's voice was steady, despite the tremor of excitement in his chest. Henderson scratched his chin. "Well, it ain't much good for anything but a garden ornament, is it? Tell you what, I'll take 200 for it. Just want it gone." A collective gasp rippled through the small group, drawn by the prospect of a transaction. $200 for that rust heap? Even the seasoned hagglers looked incredulous. 200? The younger man with the beard scoffed, louder now. "You could buy a decent set of tires for a new tractor with that kind of money, or a week's worth of groceries." The older farmer, who deemed it a waste of space, let out a booming laugh. "Tommy, you gone soft in the head? That thing's a money pit, plain and simple. You'd be better off buying a new shovel." Thomas met their gazes one by one. Pity in some eyes, outright mockery in others, but he didn't waver. He reached into his worn leather wallet, extracting a crisp 50 and 3 crumpled hundreds he'd diligently saved. This was it, the down payment on his future. "I'll take it," he said, handing the money to Mr. Henderson, whose eyebrows shot up in surprise. The proprietor smoothed the bills, a slow smile spreading across his face. The laughter grew louder then, a chorus of derision echoing through the dusty barn. "He actually bought it," someone exclaimed, disbelief lacing the words. "Looks like Thomas is going into the antique scrap metal business," another joked, and the laughter intensified. Thomas ignored it all. He stood by his new acquisition, his hand resting on the rusted hood. The taunts faded to a distant hum. In his mind, the old Farmall was already humming, already pulling a plow, already turning rich dark earth, his earth. He just had to get it home, and then the real work would begin. His dream felt a little less distant now, a little more real. It was rusty, broken, and unloved, but it was undeniably his rusted treasure. Grandpa Joe's wisdom. The late afternoon sun, a molten disk nearing the horizon, stretched long, fluid shadows as Thomas guided the rented flatbed down the familiar gravel track. The Farmall, a hulking mass of faded crimson and tenacious rust, vibrated softly with each jolt, a constant reminder of the formidable undertaking he'd embraced. He parked beside Grandpa Joe's sprawling, jumbled workshop, a structure that listed precariously, burdened by decades and unspoken stories. Grandpa Joe, a man seemingly sculpted from seasoned oak and quiet resolve, emerged from the workshop's dim interior, wiping grease from his palms with a rag worn thin by countless battles. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed almost imperceptibly as they assessed the tractor. A ghost of a smile, fleeting as a morning mist, touched his lips. "Well, I'll be," Joe rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly current. "That's quite the endeavor, Tommy." Thomas dismounted, his boots crunching on the loose stones. "It's a 1957 Farmall 4.5. Oh, Grandpa, and I'm going to coax it back to life. I'm going to make it run so I can cultivate my own land." He studied his grandfather's face, searching for any trace of doubt, a whisper of the amusement he'd encountered from others. There was none, only a steady, appraising gaze. "A farm, eh?" Joe leaned against the flatbed, arms folded across his chest. Ambitious dreams for a young man with a rusty paperweight. He paused, then his eyes twinkled. But sometimes, the grandest visions begin with the most weathered foundations. Got a blueprint, boy. Thomas unfurled his vision, his voice gaining momentum with each articulated thought. He spoke of the earth, the harvests he envisioned, the quiet gratification of honest labor. Grandpa Joe listened, offering an occasional nod, his gaze fixed on the distant fields. "All right, Tommy. If you're truly committed, I'll lend a hand. But you'll absorb every detail, every bolt, every gasket, every single component of this old iron. You'll intimately know its workings." The inaugural lesson commenced almost immediately. Joe indicated the massive engine block, a formidable bastion of grime and corroded metal. "See that cylindrical piece there? That's the air filter housing, and beneath that, the carburetor. That's where the fuel and air intermingle." He gestured with a practiced hand. "And this is a wrench, not a mallet. We reserve percussive persuasion for truly uncooperative elements." He picked up a socket wrench, demonstrating the correct grip, the nuanced pressure required. "Feel that? That's how you harness mechanical advantage. You don't just yank." The workshop itself was a sensory tapestry, rich old oil, dry sawdust, and the subtle sweet tang of metal. Tools hung on pegboards, arranged with a unique logic only Joe comprehended, each one gleaming despite its age. Thomas felt a surge of anticipation, a nascent connection to this realm of cogs and combustion. Their initial afternoon was devoted to the most fundamental task: cleansing. Grandpa Joe presented Thomas with a wire brush and a can of solvent. "Rust is a relentless adversary, Tommy, and to comprehend what you're manipulating, you must strip away the accumulated years of neglect." Thomas knelt beside the Farmall's immense rear wheel, its tire a spiderweb of cracks. He assailed the thick stratum of rust on the fender, the wire brush abrading the metal with a harsh grating sound. Clouds of reddish-brown dust billowed, clinging to his clothing, settling in his hair. The solvent, cold and acrid, dissolved the grime, revealing faint hints of the original Farmall red beneath. It was slow, meticulous labor, his arm aching from the repetitive motion, but with each stroke, a minor triumph was secured. Grandpa Joe worked silently beside him, addressing a different section of the chassis. He moved with an economical grace, his strokes deliberate and forceful. He abstained from constant instruction, preferring Thomas to learn through immersion, through observation. The rhythmic rasp of their brushes permeated the air, a steady cadence that spoke of purpose and unwavering persistence. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, Thomas paused, wiping perspiration from his brow. He surveyed the patch he'd scoured, a vivid contrast to the surrounding decay. It was a modest beginning, barely a scratch on the immense challenge, but it was a launching point, and for the first time, gazing at the venerable tractor, he no longer saw a derelict relic. He saw potential. He saw the future. Spark plugs and paint. The perfume of oil and aged metal became Thomas's constant companion. Weeks dissolved into a cycle of grime and revelation. Grandpa Joe, his hands perpetually streaked with grease, his eyes alight with understanding, initiated Thomas into the ailing heart of the Farmall. "See here, Tommy? These are your spark plugs, small wonders, yet they orchestrate everything." Thomas leaned closer, the flashlight's beam dancing over 4 soot-blackened cylinders. He'd splurged his allowance on a new set of plugs, their pristine porcelain a stark contrast to the tractor's weathered engine. Each crisp $10 bill exchanged at the hardware store felt like a personal stake, a tangible commitment to resurrecting the old machine. Grandpa Joe demonstrated the wrench's precise application, the specific angle, the gentle yet resolute twist. "Don't over-tighten, you'll strip the threads. Don't under-tighten, she'll cough and sputter." Thomas's knuckles chafed raw as he toiled. The first plug clung stubbornly, cemented by years of carbon and corrosion. He grunted, his brow furrowed in a mirror image of Grandpa Joe's focused intensity. Finally, with a protesting shriek, it yielded. He held it aloft, a small triumph, before carefully threading in its gleaming replacement. The ritual repeated 3 more times, each turn of the wrench a step closer to the tractor's awakening. When the final plug was seated, Thomas wiped his hands on a grimy rag, a quiet pride unfurling in his chest. Beyond the engine's guts, the Farmall's exterior beckoned. Grandpa Joe had unearthed a few forgotten cans of International Harvester red paint from the barn's dusty recesses. "Good as new," he'd rumbled, pressing a brush into Thomas's hand. "Just don't slop it on anything vital." Thomas meticulously scoured a section of the hood, scrubbing away rust and ancient dust until the bare metal offered a faint glint. Then, with a slow, deliberate hand, he laid down the first stroke of vibrant crimson. It bled across the dull surface, transforming it, coaxing forth a ghost of its former splendor. He worked in methodical segments, rejuvenating the rusted fenders, the faded chassis, even the chipped steering wheel. The stark juxtaposition between the fresh coat and the remaining patches of peeling red and oxidized orange served as a visual chronicle of their progress. Every brushstroke was a meditation, a silent promise whispered to the venerable machine. One particularly sweltering afternoon, as Thomas grappled with a recalcitrant bolt on the carburetor, a distinct hiss reached his ears. He looked down to see the front right tire deflating with alarming speed. His spirits plummeted. Another unforeseen obstacle. He glanced at Grandpa Joe, who was absorbed in honing an ancient axe. "Grandpa, the tire's flat." Grandpa Joe merely grunted, his gaze fixed on the whetstone. "Well, fetch the jack, boy. You know where the patching kit hides." Thomas felt a surge of initial frustration, quickly eclipsed by a flicker of resolve. He'd observed Grandpa Joe mend countless flats on various farm implements over the years. This was his proving ground. He located the heavy hydraulic jack, positioned it carefully beneath the axle, and began to pump. The tractor groaned softly as it slowly rose. He wrestled the heavy wheel free, the bolt stiff and uncooperative. His muscles screamed, but he refused to capitulate. He pinpointed the puncture in the inner tube, a small, jagged tear. He mentally replayed Grandpa Joe's instructions: clean the area, roughen it with sandpaper, apply the rubber cement, await tackiness, then press the patch firmly. He worked with an almost surgical precision, his tongue peeking out in concentration. When the patch was finally secure, a triumphant grin stretched across his face. Remounting the tire proved even more arduous than removing it. It felt heavier, more unwieldy, a cumbersome beast. He struggled, sweat stinging his eyes, but he persisted, adjusting, lifting, and finally aligning the bolt holes. He tightened the lug nuts with the cross wrench, pouring his full weight into each turn. When the tire was back in place and inflated, Thomas stepped back, panting, his shirt drenched. He had accomplished it. He had fixed it by himself. Grandpa Joe, who had appeared utterly oblivious to the entire ordeal, finally straightened, testing the axe's edge with a calloused thumb. He cast a fleeting glance at the newly inflated tire, then at Thomas. A faint, almost imperceptible smile softened the corners of his mouth. "Good job, Tommy. You're learning." Thomas beamed, the profound satisfaction of the accomplishment washing away his exhaustion. The Farmall was still far from roaring to life, but with new spark plugs, a fresh coat of paint, and now a fully patched tire, it felt less like a forgotten relic and more like a sleeping giant, slowly stirring. He saw not merely a rusty machine, but the promise of furrowed fields, of abundant harvests, of a future he was forging with his own two hands. The roar of life. The morning sun, still a cool orange orb, cast long shadows across the barn floor as Thomas nudged the Farmall into position. Today was the day. 9 months of relentless effort, scraped knuckles, and endless hours poring over manuals had culminated in this moment. The tractor, once a skeletal rust heap, now gleamed in its fresh coat of IH red, the white grille a stark contrast. It looked new, almost. But the real test wasn't its appearance. Grandpa Joe, his face a map of sun-worn wrinkles, circled the Farmall, his eyes narrowed in inspection. He ran a hand over a newly tightened bolt on the manifold, then tapped the tire with his knuckles, listening to the solid thud. "Oil's good," he grunted, not looking at Thomas. "Full to the mark, Grandpa. New filter, too." Thomas's voice was steady, but a nervous tremor buzzed beneath his calm exterior. He double-checked the fuel line, tracing it from the tank to the carburetor. No leaks, not a single drip. The air filter, a pristine replacement, sat snugly in its housing. He'd even greased every fitting until the old grease was purged, replaced by fresh, bright lubricant. Grandpa Joe nodded slowly, then moved to the battery. He wiggled the terminals, testing the connections. "Spark plugs gapped, right?" "To spec, Grandpa. Everyone." Thomas had spent an entire afternoon meticulously cleaning and gapping each plug, visualizing the tiny spark that would ignite the engine's breath. He remembered the laughter from Old Man Henderson at the feed store when he'd bought the new plugs, asking if he was trying to start a rock. Thomas had just smiled then. He wasn't smiling now. His focus was absolute. Finally, Grandpa Joe straightened up, his gaze meeting Thomas's. A flicker of something Thomas couldn't quite name, pride perhaps, or just deep satisfaction, danced in his grandfather's eyes. "All right, Tommy, give it a shot." Thomas swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. He climbed onto the worn seat, the fabric cool beneath his jeans. The scent of fresh paint mingled with a faint underlying aroma of old oil and diesel. He pressed the clutch pedal, feeling the familiar resistance, then shifted the gear lever into neutral. Every movement was deliberate, ingrained from countless hours spent tinkering. He took a deep breath, his heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the ignition key. He slid it into the lock, the metal cold against his fingertip. He turned it slowly, the click echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet barn. The starter whined, a high-pitched, hopeful sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The engine coughed once, a ragged, hesitant gasp, then sputtered and died. Thomas's shoulders slumped, a wave of disappointment washing over him. He heard a soft sigh from Grandpa Joe. He turned the key again. The starter whined, longer this time. The engine struggled, a series of uneven chugs like a beast trying to wake from a long slumber. It caught for a fraction of a second, a single weak cylinder firing, then silence. "Give it a little choke, Tommy," Grandpa Joe advised, his voice calm, devoid of judgment. Thomas pulled the choke knob out a hair's breadth. He knew the drill. The old Farmalls were particular. He twisted the key for the third time. The starter engaged with a more determined growl. This time, the engine caught. Not with a clean burst, but a series of uneven, lurching explosions. Blue-white smoke puffed from the exhaust pipe, thick and acrid, filling the air. It coughed, it bucked, it threatened to die again. Thomas held his breath, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He felt the vibrations through the seat, the whole tractor shaking like an animal trying to shake off a deep sleep. He pressed the accelerator pedal gently, feeding it just a touch more fuel. Then, with a sudden, glorious burst, the engine roared. It was a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through his very bones, a symphony of power and rekindled life. The blue smoke cleared, replaced by a steady, rhythmic thrum. The exhaust note settled into a powerful, even idle. Thomas let out a whoop, a raw, triumphant sound that bounced off the barn rafters. He gripped the steering wheel, a wide, unrestrained grin splitting his face. The Farmall was alive. He glanced at Grandpa Joe, who stood by the front tire, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. The old man just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory. The air vibrated with the roar of life, a sound that promised fields plowed, crops sown, and a future born from sheer will and a rusted piece of history. This wasn't just a tractor. It was a testament, a small patch of dreams. The keen morning air nipped at Thomas's skin, but an internal warmth, quite distinct from the burgeoning sun, began to unfurl within him. He stood by the Farmall, a beacon of restored crimson, its engine a placid purr against the pre-dawn quiet. Beyond Grandpa Joe's modest, weather-beaten home lay a quarter-acre, long seeded to tenacious weeds and a forgotten snarl of blackberry vines. This was his ground, his nascent vision. "Ready to kick up some dust, son?" Grandpa Joe's voice, raspy from decades of shouting over machinery, sliced through the quietude. He leaned against the porch post, mug steaming in his calloused hands, a faint smile playing on his lips. Thomas returned a genuine, unburdened grin, a sensation that felt rare these days. He swung onto the tractor seat, the worn leather a familiar comfort. With a gentle press of the clutch and a deliberate shift, the Farmall eased forward, its plow biting into the resistant earth. The first furrow unspooled like a dark ribbon, exposing tangled roots and releasing the rich, loamy scent of disturbed soil. Each pass affirmed hours of workshop toil, of grease-stained hands and stubborn persistence. The old tractor, once a rusty relic, now moved with a renewed purpose, mirroring Thomas's own resolve. He worked steadily, the sun arcing higher, stretching and then shrinking the shadows around him. Sweat beaded on his brow, commingling with the fine dust kicked up by the turning earth. The physical exertion was a balm, a silent understanding between man, machine, and land. When the last clod of earth yielded, the quarter-acre lay transformed, a dark, fertile canvas awaiting new life. Later that afternoon, with the sun a pleasant weight on his shoulders, Thomas traversed the freshly tilled ground. A sack of corn seeds was slung over one arm, a smaller bag of pumpkin seeds cradled in the other. He knelt, pressing each kernel into the soft earth, envisioning the emerald shoots pushing skyward, the tall stalks swaying in the summer breeze, the plump orange pumpkins nestled among their sprawling vines. It was a humble ambition, a world away from the vast fields that carpeted the valley, but it was profoundly his. He perceived the future in these tiny seeds, a future he was actively cultivating with his own hands. The roar of a diesel engine shattered his reverie. A gleaming modern John Deere, its cab air-conditioned and its tires impossibly wide, rumbled past on the dirt road bordering Grandpa Joe's property. At the wheel sat Hank Peterson, a man whose field seemed to touch the horizon, his expression typically a mask of smug satisfaction. Beside him, Old Man Jenkins, renowned for his biting wit, rode shotgun. Hank slowed the colossal tractor, its engine idling with a contemptuous growl. He leaned out, a humorless chuckle escaping him. "Well, looky here, Jenkins. Tommy's got himself a garden plot, girl." Jenkins, his leathery face a road map of sneers, cupped a hand to his ear. "Can't hear you, Hank. Is he planting petunias or something equally useful?" His sharp, judgmental gaze swept over Thomas's small, hand-planted patch. Thomas straightened, brushing dirt from his jeans. He met their stares squarely, refusing to let their derision take root. "Planting corn and pumpkins," he stated, his voice calm, resolute. "Figured it's a good year for it." Hank laughed outright, a booming sound that reverberated across the valley. "Corn and pumpkins, eh? On a quarter-acre? You planning on feeding a squirrel family, Tommy, or maybe selling a single pumpkin for Halloween?" He gestured dismissively at the Farmall, now parked near the farmhouse. "That old relic won't even cover its own fuel cost for a patch that size." Jenkins cackled, a dry, rattling sound. Just like his grandpa, always tinkering with old junk. Some people just don't know when to quit pretending they're farmers. Thomas felt a familiar constriction in his chest, a flicker of the frustration that had plagued him for months, but it was swiftly replaced by a quiet resolve. He looked from their mocking faces to the dark, expectant earth. "It's a start," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. He picked up another handful of corn seeds, letting them sift through his fingers. "Everyone starts somewhere." Hank and Jenkins exchanged another glance, one of shared amusement and disdain, before Hank gunned the John Deere, leaving a billowing cloud of dust in their wake. As the roar faded, Thomas turned back to his patch of earth. He knew they'd laugh, he knew they'd doubt, but the feel of the soil beneath his hands, the promise of life contained within each tiny seed, was more tangible, more potent than any ridicule they could offer. He had his patch, his tractor, and a growing conviction that the biggest harvests often sprouted from the smallest of dreams. The storm's fury. The sky, a bruised purple an hour ago, ripped open with a sound like tearing canvas. Rain didn't fall. It descended in sheets, driven by a wind that howled like a banshee through the eaves of the old farmhouse. Thomas stood at the window, watching the pecan trees outside thrash violently, their branches skeletal against the flashes of lightning that momentarily turned the world stark white. Thunder rumbled, not just overhead, but seemingly from deep within the earth itself, vibrating through the floorboards. "This ain't just a spring shower, Tommy." Grandpa Joe's voice, surprisingly calm amidst the din, cut through the storm's fury. He was by the radio, fiddling with the dial, trying to catch a local report. "County's going to be underwater by morning." The power flickered, then died, plunging the kitchen into a deeper gloom. Thomas grabbed a lantern, its warm glow pushing back against the encroaching darkness. He worried about the fields, about the young sprouts that had just begun to show promise. A deluge like this, especially after the dry spell, could wash away everything. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a scene of devastation. Roads were impassable, turned into muddy rivers. Trees lay scattered like discarded toys, fences were down, and the fields, once neat rows of emerging green, were now a vast, shimmering lake. Thomas and Grandpa Joe trudged out, their boots sinking deep into the viscous mud with every step. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and bruised foliage. As they surveyed their waterlogged acreage, a faint rhythmic thumping carried on the damp air. It grew louder, accompanied by frustrated shouts. Rounding the bend of their dirt track, they came upon a sight that, despite the gravity of the situation, almost made Thomas smile. Two brand-new, gleaming green tractors, massive beasts with tires wider than Thomas's chest, were bogged down to their axles in the churned-up earth. Their owners, farmers from the neighboring properties, stood by, mud-splattered and fuming, their expensive machinery rendered useless. "Fancy new toys, eh?" Grandpa Joe muttered, a glint in his eye. "Guess all that horsepower ain't worth much when you can't get no traction." Thomas nodded, the memory of their laughter at his old Farmall still fresh. He remembered the derision, the jokes about his rusty relic. Now, their modern marvels were sinking monuments to their own hubris. "We got to get the water off the corn, Grandpa," Thomas said, his mind already racing, "before the roots rot." Grandpa Joe looked at the Farmall, parked under the lean-to, a humble splash of red against the gray morning. "Think that old girl can handle it? She's got good ground clearance, and those narrow tires will cut through the mud, not just float on top," Thomas replied, already heading for the shed. He felt a surge of determination. This was their chance, not just to save their crops, but to prove the worth of the steadfast, the overlooked. Starting the Farmall was a familiar ritual, the old engine catching with a satisfying rumble. Thomas engaged the PTO, attaching the old ditch witch they'd pulled from the back of the barn. The mud was a formidable adversary, clinging to the tires, trying to drag the tractor down. But the Farmall, with its tall, spoked wheels, bit into the treacherous ground. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless. Hour after hour, Thomas guided the Farmall, carving shallow trenches to drain the standing water from their fields. The roar of the engine was a steady counterpoint to the squelch of mud and the slosh of draining water. Grandpa Joe followed behind, clearing debris, his face grim but his eyes alight with pride. Thomas pushed the Farmall to its limits, feeling the strain in his own muscles, but fueled by a quiet resolve. The sun, having finally broken through the clouds, beat down, turning the mud into a sticky, energy-sapping quagmire. Sweat plastered his hair to his forehead, and his clothes were caked in mud. But Thomas didn't stop. He saw the water level slowly, steadily recede. The corn, though battered, still stood, granted a reprieve. The work was backbreaking, but as the last of the standing water flowed away, a profound sense of accomplishment settled over him. As dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Thomas drove the Farmall back towards the farmhouse, the old tractor still chugging dutifully. He passed the two stuck modern tractors again. Their owners were gone, presumably to fetch heavier recovery equipment. Thomas just waved a weary hand, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of a battle fought and won, not with flash and expense, but with grit, a little bit of wisdom, and a very stubborn, very red, old Farmall. A helping hand. The sun, a fiery orb climbing higher in the late morning sky, beat down on the parched earth, but the air around Thomas felt charged with a different kind of heat. Not from the sun, but from the palpable tension radiating from the cluster of farmers gathered at the edge of Old Man Peterson's field. Their usual boisterous chatter had died down to a low murmur, their gazes fixed on the scene before them. Peterson's hulking green John Deere, usually a symbol of agricultural might, was mired deep in a pocket of unexpectedly soft soil, its rear wheels churning uselessly, spraying clumps of wet dirt like a struggling beast. Beside it, almost comically small in comparison, sat Thomas atop his cherry-red Farmall, its engine a steady, confident thrum. Thomas had arrived at Peterson's request, a plea delivered by a sheepish teenager after Peterson had exhausted his own efforts and the patience of his neighbors. The offer of payment had been waved away by Thomas with a quiet shake of his head. "Just need to see what she can do," he'd said, his eyes scanning the angle of the stuck tractor, the lay of the land. Now, a heavy tow chain, thick as a man's wrist, connected the two machines. The farmers watched, some with thinly veiled skepticism, others with a dawning curiosity. They'd heard the whispers about Thomas and his toy tractor, the same whispers that usually dissolved into chuckles at the general store. With a deep breath, Thomas engaged the Farmall's clutch. The small tractor dug in, its tires biting into the dry soil with an almost defiant grip. For a moment, nothing happened. Peterson's Deere remained stubbornly embedded. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the large tractor shuddered. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Thomas, leaning forward, coaxed more power from the Farmall, his face a mask of concentration. The little red machine strained, its engine note deepening, a plume of exhaust puffing skyward. Inch by agonizing inch, the John Deere began to move, its massive tires slowly clawing their way free of the mud's embrace. When the larger tractor finally broke free with a wet sucking sound, rolling onto firmer ground, a cheer erupted from the assembled farmers, a sound of genuine awe and surprise. Peterson, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief, lumbered over, extending a calloused hand. "Miller, I don't know what to say. I thought for sure I'd be stuck till harvest." The incident spread like wildfire through the valley, not as a whisper, but as a shout. Soon, other farmers, their own equipment struggling with the late spring rains and unexpected soil conditions, began to approach Thomas. Old Man Henderson, whose fields had been battered by an unseasonal hailstorm, leaving his young corn shoots flattened, was the first. He found Thomas patching a fence line, his movements practiced and efficient. "Tommy," Henderson began, his voice raspy, "I know you're busy, but my old Ford just ain't got the traction to get through the wet spots, keeps bogging down." Thomas wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He considered Henderson's plight, the desperation in the older man's eyes. "I can be there by noon," Thomas offered simply, the Farmall already chugging towards Henderson's fields a few hours later, its small plow attachments slicing neat furrows into the damp earth. The Farmall, lighter and more agile, navigated the tricky terrain with ease, its steady rhythm a comforting sound as it meticulously replanted row after row. He didn't ask for payment from Henderson, nor from Mrs. O'Malley, whose ancient baler had seized up mid-field, leaving her hay exposed to potential rain. Each time, Thomas arrived with the Farmall, his quiet competence speaking louder than any boast. He fixed, he pulled, he plowed. His hands, once soft from less strenuous work, were now calloused and strong, his movements imbued with a newfound confidence. Grandpa Joe, observing Thomas from the porch one evening as his grandson cleaned the Farmall, a faint smile played on his lips. "They're learning, son," he mused, his voice gravelly. "They're learning that a loud engine don't always mean the strongest heart." Thomas simply nodded, polishing a chrome emblem on the tractor. He wasn't doing it for the recognition, but the gratitude was undeniable. Farmers, often gruff and reserved, would stop him in town, offering a firm handshake, a nod of genuine respect, or a basket of fresh eggs. Young Billy Jenkins, whose family dairy farm was perpetually struggling, pressed a warm, still steaming loaf of bread into Thomas's hands one afternoon. "My mother baked it for you," he mumbled, his cheeks flushing, "for helping with the pasture fence." The laughter had faded, replaced by a quiet admiration. Thomas, once the subject of their amusement, was now becoming a pillar of support, a silent red-painted testament to perseverance and unexpected strength. The Farmall, once a symbol of his folly, was now a beacon of hope across the county. Harvest and opportunity. The crisp morning air carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke as Thomas loaded the last crate onto the flatbed. His back ached with a satisfying weariness, a testament to the weeks of toil that had preceded this day. The pumpkins, fat and orange, gleamed in the early light. The winter squash, in shades of deep green and mottled gold, felt heavy and solid in his hands. Even the late-season sweet corn, despite the skeptics, had yielded a surprising bounty, its kernels bursting with sugary sweetness. Grandpa Joe, leaning against the porch post, watched with a quiet pride that warmed Thomas more than any sunshine. "Looks like a good haul, boy," Grandpa Joe rasped, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The folks at the market will be pleased." Thomas just grinned, a genuine, unburdened smile. He remembered the snickers, the knowing glances, the outright laughter when he'd first started tilling that small plot. They'd called it a fool's errand, a waste of good money and time. Now, looking at the overflowing truck, a quiet triumph settled deep within him. The market was bustling, a cacophony of vendors hawking their wares, the chatter of shoppers and the occasional bray of a donkey. Thomas found a spot near the edge, his display vibrant and inviting. He priced his produce fairly, remembering Grandpa Joe's adage, "Good work deserves good value, but honesty keeps folks coming back." The vibrant colors of his harvest drew attention. A woman with a sensible shopping basket paused, her eyes widening at the size of his pumpkins. "My goodness, young man, these are magnificent," she exclaimed, picking up a hefty squash. "How much for this beauty?" Before long, a steady stream of customers converged on his stall. The sweetness of the corn, the firm texture of the squash, the sheer abundance of it all spoke for itself. Thomas handled each transaction with a quiet confidence, his hands counting out change, his voice clear as he answered questions about his growing methods. By midday, the crates were noticeably lighter, and a satisfying weight had accumulated in his money pouch. The sun climbed higher, warming his shoulders, and he felt a thrill of achievement he hadn't known before. This wasn't just money, it was validation, a tangible result of his dedication. As the afternoon wore on and the last of his squash found a new home, Thomas overheard a conversation between two farmers at a neighboring stall. "Heard the Peterson place is finally up for grabs," one said, adjusting his cap. "About time," the other grumbled. "Old man Peterson let that land go to seed. Shame, really. Good, fertile ground, that is." Thomas's ears perked up. The Peterson farm. It was a sprawling piece of land, almost 80 acres, bordering Grandpa Joe's property to the west. He remembered it well, mostly overgrown fields and a dilapidated farmhouse. But the soil, as the farmer said, was excellent. He'd often gazed at it from Grandpa Joe's back porch, envisioning neat rows of crops stretching to the horizon. He approached the two men cautiously. "Excuse me," he began. "You mentioned the Peterson farm is for sale?" The first farmer, a grizzled man named Frank, eyed Thomas. "That's right, son. Real estate agents got the listing. Asking quite a bit, last I heard." Thomas's heart quickened. He thanked them and hurried to find Grandpa Joe, who was patiently waiting by the truck, enjoying a piece of apple pie from a bakery stall. "Grandpa Joe!" Thomas burst out, his voice tinged with excitement. "The Peterson farm? It's for sale!" Grandpa Joe slowly chewed his pie, his gaze steady. "Is it now? Knew that day would come eventually. Old man Peterson's kids were never much for farming." Thomas pulled out his money pouch, the coins clinking musically. "I've made a good bit today, Grandpa. More than I expected. And with what I've saved, I think I might have enough for a down payment." Grandpa Joe's eyes, usually so calm, held a flicker of surprise, then a deepening warmth. He reached out, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. "Well, I'll be. You've done more than good, Thomas. You've proved them all wrong. And if you've got the ambition and the money, then that Peterson land is more than just a farm for sale. It's an opportunity, plain and simple." The words resonated deep within Thomas. An opportunity, not just to expand his operation, but to build something lasting, something real. The laughter of the skeptics faded into a distant echo, replaced by the satisfying weight of the money in his hand and the vast, hopeful expanse of the Peterson farm stretching out in his mind's eye. The harvest had been good, but the harvest of opportunity felt even sweeter. The biggest farm in the county. The weight of the pen felt substantial in Thomas's grasp, a welcome ballast against the surprising lightness in his chest. Mr. Henderson, the land agent, offered a broad smile from across the gleaming oak, a flash of gold in his front tooth. Thomas's signature flowed onto the document, stark black ink on the pristine white legal form. A hearty clap from Grandpa Joe resonated on his shoulder, more a cheer of triumph than a simple pat. The air, redolent with aged paper and faint coffee, perfectly encapsulated the moment, a blend of inherited history and vibrant new beginnings. "Congratulations, Thomas," Mr. Henderson stated, extending a hand across the desk. "You're officially the owner of the old Abernathy spread. It's quite a property." His gaze lingered, perhaps puzzled by how a man barely out of his 20s had orchestrated such a feat. Thomas merely inclined his head, a quiet contentment settling deep within. Around them, a small assembly of local farmers, the very men whose fields had flourished from his tireless efforts in the surprisingly resilient Farmall, murmured their approval. There was Silas, whose recent harvests had been bumper crops thanks to the old tractor, and Mrs. Peterson, now able to afford a much-needed replacement for her failing irrigation pump. Their presence was more than just support. It was living proof of Thomas's quiet determination's far-reaching impact. He pushed back, the chair's protesting creak a punctuation mark, signifying the close of one chapter and the opening of another. Outside, the late autumn air was sharp, carrying the faint tang of wood smoke from distant hearths. Above, the sky stretched, an unbroken expanse of cerulean. A week later, the Farmall traversed the newly acquired acreage. Its crimson paint, once scuffed and dull, now gleamed with a fresh coat Thomas had meticulously applied. The fields unfolded before him, seemingly without end, a mosaic of stubble and fallow earth. From the highest elevation on the property, Thomas commanded a view for miles, his land stretching to the horizon. The wind tugged at his hair, bringing the distant cry of a crow. He recalled the scornful laughter, the veiled jibes when he'd first paid a paltry sum for the rusty machine. Now, 9 months later, he presided over the largest farm in the county. The delicious irony wasn't lost on him. Perched on the weathered wooden fence at the property line, Grandpa Joe watched Thomas drive. His eyes, fanned with a network of wrinkles from years of sun and knowing smiles, held a profound pride. He offered little commentary, just a satisfied hum as the tractor's engine faded into the distance. He had always understood that true worth wasn't in outward polish, but in the spirit of the one who guided it. The seasons turned, and with them, the fortunes of Miller Farm. What had once been a modest parcel burgeoned into a sprawling domain of fertile land. Thomas's reputation, forged by diligent work and subtle innovation, grew with each harvest. It wasn't long before the familiar sight of pickup trucks pulling up to his farmhouse became an everyday occurrence. One sweltering July afternoon, Old Man Hemlock, a farmer legendary for his tenacity, discovered Thomas tinkering with the Farmall's carburetor. Hemlock typically kept to himself, preferring to learn lessons the hard way. "Thomas," Hemlock began, his voice raspy, "my corn, it's not right, yellowing at the tips, thin stalks, never seen anything like it." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable in his vulnerability. Thomas straightened, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He listened intently, his gaze thoughtful. "Did you rotate your crops this year, Mr. Hemlock?" he inquired, his voice even. "And your soil pH? Had it tested lately?" Hemlock blinked, taken aback by the directness. "Well, no, not precisely. Always done it my way." Thomas nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Sometimes the old ways need a fresh look, Mr. Hemlock, or a completely new approach. Come on, I'll show you what I did with my nitrogen levels last spring." He neither boasted nor lectured. He simply shared his insights, his observations, what had proven effective for him. Other farmers, like Silas and Mrs. Peterson, also sought his counsel, not just on crop rotation or irrigation, but on managing vast acreage, on striking the delicate balance between tradition and novel techniques. The laughter that had once dogged him had long since vanished, replaced by respectful nods and genuine gratitude. The largest farm in the county wasn't solely a testament to land and machinery. It was a tribute to a young man who grasped that true value, much like a steadfast old Farmall, often lay concealed beneath a bit of rust and a wealth of untapped potential.